hackers, and welcome to the podcast. I'm Celine, a media graduate with an interest in cults.
And I'm her dad. I'm Stephen. I'm these days an organisational psychologist, but I was raised in a high control group or cult. I left when I was about 30, when you were born, Celine. So today we are very lucky to be able to speak to Olivia Jackson. Olivia is author of a really important and interesting book, and I think it's a piece of research. It's called Uncertain, and that is a collective memoir of deconstructing faith. So obviously we'll get Olivia to tell us about the book, but welcome to the show, Olivia.
Thank you. Hi.
Right, it's really interesting. It's a really good book. First of all, we'll encourage our listeners to buy a copy. It's a fascinating book. It's fairly recently released, so it's something that I think should be on people's Christmas list if they're interested in that sort of thing. So tell us a little bit, if you don't mind, Olivia, about your story. So why write a book like this, and where are you coming from? What's your interest in this sort of topic?
Well, I got involved in sort of evangelical Christianity when I was 14. And while there was, for me at that age, there was actually a lot of good about it in terms of I was a very shy 14-year-old. I was miserable at school, and suddenly I had all these shiny, happy new friends. And I think it gave me those friendships gave me a great deal of joy, of I suppose, just companionship at a time. We all have a pretty rough teenage experience, I think. And I was unhappy and being bullied in school and things, and it was something different from that. As things went on, I think things got more and more controlling. I ended up working after university. I worked for a missions organization overseas, It was a broadly American-based organization, youth mission organization, and just a heck of a lot of rules. And it was really what I think sociologists refer to as a total institution. So it was my employer, it was my social life, it was my housing provider, and it was also telling me, what I should believe, really. There was very little space to question the group beliefs, the broader ideology, or what your leaders said. Your leaders very much spoke for God, and if you felt that God, whatever or whoever that might be, was saying something different, then what your leaders said definitely trumped that. And I worked for them for about 10 years, and I left pretty cynical, actually. And I think my process of leaving that I didn't realize at the time, but had really, my process of leaving that sort of type of faith had already begun. Just questioning things like, well, why are these systems so patriarchal? I mean, the organization I worked for did have women in leadership, but it was still pretty patriarchal. I think questioning the way that I saw my friends who were LGBTQ plus being treated, things like being forced to publicly confess, and their, not even their relationships being condemned, but their sexual orientation being condemned. I think I had really started to question a lot of that stuff by the time I left. And I think over the years, things just started to unravel more and more. Belief in hell, that kind of thing. And finding others who were also questioning things, beginning to question what I'd grown up being taught and believing, and the systems as well, particularly the systems in which I had been taught those things. And really, finding that there were a lot of resources out there about what's come to be known as faith deconstruction, but so many of them, with the exception of a few podcasts, so many of the books particularly were American based, which is, there are huge overlaps, and the British evangelicalism, conservative evangelicalism, is very much influenced by American churches, particularly the big mega churches, particularly in an age of internet. But we do still have a different experience. And I just thought, why is there nothing out there which is, British based? And then it was, mid first lockdown, I suddenly thought, well, maybe I should write. No, I should not write something. And, it's just that little niggle, which I think which I think I once would have called, God speaking to me. And just sort of thinking, well, maybe I could tell my story. No, nobody wants to listen to my story. Okay, maybe I can just tell other people's stories, and people who don't have a huge platform already, not the celebrities who deconstruct, but actually the person who's been, faithfully going to youth group, faithfully serving their church, maybe working for a church or a mission agency. What is their experience like? Why did they deconstruct? What's the process for them? Where have they landed now? So I just started collecting stories, basically interviewing people. I put a survey online, surveyed, I think, 400 people, which was a bit more than I'd bargained for. And interviewed 150 of them, which again was a lot more than I'd bargained for. And the transcription was interesting.
Just incredible amount of work.
I will admit, I kind of thought I was going to get maybe 20 half-hour interviews, but the survey itself took people about 20 minutes to fill in.
Wow.
So for a bunch of strangers to fill that in for, someone they'd never met. I also realized with that, though, and the number of people willing to tell their stories, there's such a, people are desperate to have their story, to tell their stories, to process this. A lot of people sort of said to me, well, a lot of people actually said, which was fantastic, this survey's been really helpful. I've never thought things through in this kind of a way before, in this kind of structured way. But then people telling their stories, some of them would say, oh, this is the first time I've told my whole story out loud. This is the first time I've spoken about this, or thanks for the free therapy. Which was, I tried to follow academic guidelines in terms of ethics, but it's not an academic book. And it was very much more conversational than academic. But I really, there was no one whose story I just thought, well, that was boring or that was pointless. It was, everyone. It was so rich, and I'm just amazed that so many people were willing to trust me with their stories.
Yeah, I mean that's so interesting, and in a way, I think that's we don't produce it into a book. Although I have thought about, all the people we've spoken to so far on the podcast. I've never counted it up, but I think there must be around 100 people already that we've spoken to. So everybody's different, everybody's experience is different, but there are those common themes, and obviously we want to talk to you about some of those. But it's a fascinating piece of work and incredibly ambitious to take that on. So and a really interesting way of getting those stories out there. So thanks for that. It's brilliant, and again, I would recommend people read it.
With your early entrance into this world, so you said you're around 14 when you kind of got involved with all of this. It's something that I asked Rachel, that was on our show before as well, around, because she joined a group when she was sort of in that age range, and I think it is something that a lot of people can attest to, sort of being brought into these groups at that time. And I kind of think to myself, well, being a minor and being brought into these groups, we need to protect everybody, but especially this age group. Like, do you have any thoughts around that specifically?
I think there are some massive safeguarding red flags there. I know that with the organisation I worked for, there was specifically something called the 414 window, which was, and that's not just that organisation, that's a well-known thing, which is specifically targeting children between the ages of 4 and 14 for evangelism, with the idea that that's when they're most open to the Lord. But I now see that very differently. I think that for me, well, for anybody at that age, 14 is, you are going through turmoil, whatever's going on in your life. Your hormones are all over the place and you're starting to push against your family. And for me, I think to an extent it was a slight form of teenage rebellion, to do something totally different from my family. But I also think, it's what we learn in those years, those early years, sort of up to about sort of 14, you don't really start, those are the years where most of us are still behaving in class and not questioning our parents. And so actually the church stuff that you get taught in those years really goes in. You don't question that, maybe until much later, if at all. And I think that to target children in that age group is, on one hand, I think it's profoundly cynical and dangerous. On the other hand, I know that when you have a real fear that those people are going to hell if they don't get saved, then it can feel like you are doing the best by this child. And I think so many things are done by people in high control groups out of their own fear and their own their best intentions, but which are profoundly harmful. It's amazing to me how many people who weren't brought up in those groups got involved either sort of in that sort of age bracket, or if they were adults at a really low point when they had a crisis. Maybe a relationship had broken down, someone had died, a job had been lost, this kind of thing. That's when they get involved. And again, a healthy organization would be saying, well, hang on, let's make a commitment here until we've actually sorted out what else is going on in your life, and not actually targeting those people. So I'm now profoundly cynical about that. I also see that having got involved, I was quite frequently, because my family weren't considered saved. My father had died when I was 6, so my mother was my sole surviving parent, and I was quite often being told, well, she's not a real Christian, so she can't really understand, and so you should listen to us and not her. And to tell a child that they should not listen to their parent, and to listen to the group instead, is just, massive safeguarding red flags there.
Sinister.
Yeah, really sinister.
Sinister.
Yeah, and I suppose it's what do we, as a wider society, want to be doing that? Should we be doing about that? Because obviously it's such a difficult one as to how we protect you and what rules can you put in place. But do you think we should be putting stronger rules in place?
I have no idea what those rules would be or how they would be policed. I think it's very much, the issues come up in the news again this week about the potential ban on conversion therapy. And a lot of conversion therapy, or a lot of other sinister practices within high control groups, it doesn't look like therapy, and maybe it's not as violent as electric shock therapy or something. It's, well, I'll pray for you. It's the subtle pressure. It's the water you swim in. It's the fact that perhaps you've been brought up thinking this is right or this is wrong, and so you go along with it. And it's not therapy, but it's still pressure. And I think all those areas, they're often subtle. They often don't appear until you get further in. They won't be spoken about from the front very often. Sometimes they will. Not very often, though. You have to go digging, and I've gone digging. But how do you? On the other hand, we now have laws against coercive control. Can it be covered by coercive control? In some cases, yes. Coercive control is an incredibly slippery thing to pin down and to legislate against. Somehow we've managed to do it. But again, how do you police that? How do you police what is being told to children? And children in our broader society are told all sorts of harmful things. And I just don't know how do we protect them from all the harm that's out there, particularly when it's being done with best intentions in mind. And then there's the explicitly harmful stuff that's done to children around child discipline in churches, which is, that's a whole other thing. And that, I think a lot of that does actually fall under existing child abuse laws.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And yeah, I think it is difficult. And the coercive control laws currently only apply to an intimate relationship or a familial relationship. So currently, I think it's difficult to use those laws around cults. It's one of the things that I know, we've spoken about on this podcast quite a bit, and I know that the Family Survival Trust is working on that. So yeah, it is hard. And I suppose the other thing that I guess is quite tricky is that in your case, it wasn't like you were brought up in it, so you weren't raised in the organisation. But I guess there's a lot of parents that would actually be quite relieved of their kids going off to Christian camp, as opposed to smoking at the corner of the street, So it feels perhaps to some parents like, oh, this is a safe sort of environment for them as well.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, for my mother, it's, the thing is she's no longer alive, and I can't ask her about this now, and I can't apologize either, which is awful for some of the things that I did and said. But I do think she was really pleased that I'd found a great new group of friends, and things that I enjoyed doing, which included, as a teenager, going overseas on short-term mission trips. But I think if she had known the half of what I was being taught, then I think she would have had more to say. And I think there were times when I said something particularly judgy or behaved in obnoxious ways when she did question things. But by that stage, it was very much, it was the us and them. Oh, well, you wouldn't possibly understand. And, this kind of thing. And I had that sort of ingrained, well, she's not a real Christian, therefore I should be listening to the group and not to her. Going on. But I do think for a lot of parents, and I think probably for her initially, it was great, great new group of friends. She's happy.
Yeah, absolutely. So can I just talk about some of the themes that come out of these discussions that you had with these people? I've picked a few just because they interested me, but obviously you may have other favourites you want to talk about, Olivia. But this idea of sin management, that's one of the chapter headings, I think. And then there's another one that I noted down, which was the heart is treacherous. So I was raised on a particular translation of the Bible called the New World Translation, which is Jehovah's Witnesses' own translation. And in that version, it says, the heart is treacherous, who can know it? It has this sort of way of putting it. But that's kind of, I think that's the bit of the Bible that you talk about there, this kind of fear of ourself or our own nature. So these are sorts of teachings that you see as quite potentially damaging and harmful to us. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you found out when you were talking to people about that?
Yeah, this came up again and again. This was a teaching which most people had heard. It is, it's a Bible verse taken very much out of context. The other one that's often lumped in with it is trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not in your own understanding. Which, it's the same thing. Don't trust your own understanding.
That's right.
Trust, basically, in effect, it's trust what the group tells you God says.
That's right.
Or what your leaders tell you. What it means, in effect, is that there is a constant, the bar is set very high for what constitutes sin or sinfulness. And it is a constant lack of trust in people. Everyone is constantly policed. No one can be trusted to, just get on with a life without falling into sin. And it also means there's no privacy. Anybody can ask you a question at any time about the sin in your life or how your spiritual life is going or what your thought life is. So that's, sins can even be thoughts. You're constantly policing your own thoughts. It's very much, Robert J. Lifton's thing of milieu control. It is that intrapersonal milieu control where you are policing your own thoughts. You are having to confess to sinful thoughts, that kind of thing. I don't think the leaders get questioned very often, but the rest of us certainly did. There's a sort of constant accountability. Often I found I was assigned a mentor or a leader, and they were assigned to me without, regardless of my trust in them. At times, someone I hadn't even met before. But then if you don't share your deepest, darkest thoughts and sins, you are told you have trust issues. Or you have, an accountability partner who tends to be a peer, and you can, you can ask each other at any time. You get together for these accountability sessions and, tell them what your sins are, this kind of thing. It also means that a lot of stuff is attributed to sin, things that go wrong in your life. I've heard of everything from car accidents to miscarriages and fertility issues to mental health issues, attributed to, oh, well, it's because you've got sin in your life. I know that when I was I had undiagnosed PTSD, and I had been prescribed antidepressants, and I was talking to one of my leaders about this, and she just, she gave me a real hard stare, and she said, "Is there sin in your life?" And, I look back and I laugh, but actually, and I think at the time I just thought, I was getting cynical by then, and I just thought, for heaven's sake, this is
nonsense.
Yeah, this is absolute nonsense. And the other practice I came across, I don't know how widespread this is. I've certainly come across it in more than one church, in more than one organization. But when I asked on a group that I'm on of people who've left the organization I used to work for, how many people went through this, there were a lot of stories in what's not a huge group, and stories from all ages as well. People who left decades ago, people who left a couple of years ago, of what we used to call openness and brokenness sessions, where basically shortly after you arrive, maybe in the first couple of weeks, you're all put in a room together, all the students put in a room together, and you are expected to confess to sins, and also confess to sins which have been committed against you. Perhaps you were sexually assaulted, perhaps you were abused as a child, this kind of thing. And you're supposed to confess to what other people have done to you as well. And this can go on for hours. And you're just, you're shut in this room. You don't break for meals or necessarily. You can maybe go to the loo, but that's about it. And you've got a group of effectively strangers confessing supposed sins for hours, and it makes you incredibly vulnerable. And it gives you that huge inappropriate bonding, basically, to your peers and to the group. You have been incredibly vulnerable, and in that context, you are far more likely to then trust the group, believe the group's doctrines, because you've bought in. It makes it much more difficult to question that.
Yeah, that's something that I think is actually being talked about a lot more on social media. I've seen recently in not just in like the cult group or high control group sense, but with sort of more narcissistic people as well, and sort of calling it like trauma bonding, and saying that you kind of or like trauma dumping, where you kind of, without permission or consent, just dump all of that onto somebody, or you try and purposely make them do it to you. And it's something that's, you kind of, it shouldn't be something that's pulled from somebody or thrust upon somebody. You kind of need to have trust and the desire to.
Margaret Singer talks about that in her book Cults in Our Midst. Actually, she describes that very thing, but in that case it was a sort of commercial setup, so it was like a coaching type setup, so everybody sat around in a room in a sort of circle and had to sort of talk about some of the most personal things that happened to them. And again, so this is a common cultic tactic, really. And the other thing that it does is it gives people power over you, because they now know stuff about you that you don't really want to go much further, but it now is, they've got this information, and it's like it can be something they hold over you. Just to clarify, that the people that you spoke to, Olivia, were these all what we might describe evangelical churches or Pentecostal churches? What
the majority
was the range?
were evangelical and Pentecostal.
Okay.
Some weren't. So one of the people who filled in the survey was a former Catholic nun. Some were a few were from more mainstream Protestant churches, but very few. I think I had two former Seventh-day Adventists. Which was interesting, because I very much grew up believing that Seventh-day Adventists, they weren't really Christians, they're a cult, etc., etc. Turns out we had an awful lot of overlap, except they got off without having to believe in hell and eternal conscious torment, which is probably why we didn't like them.
Thank you for listening to Cult Hackers, an indie podcast. That means we're not part of a big media organisation with huge advertising budgets and massive reach. So just by listening to this, you're supporting the little guy. The hardest thing for us is not content. We love recording episodes and talking to amazing and interesting people. No, by far the hardest thing is getting in front of the potential millions of listeners out there, with millions of podcasts scrambling for attention. And here's where you can help, simply by telling people about the podcast. Just telling somebody about it can really help. You can share an episode on social media or private messaging using your app, or on some apps you can leave a rating, and better still, say a few words. So please help us get Cult Hackers in front of more people. And now back to the podcast. Yeah, it's funny. We all looked at everybody else and pointed and laughed at the silly cult they were in. You reached out to us, and one of the things you said was, oh, by the way, there is purity culture in the UK, and there are. What did you describe? What was the actual term? Because I think I'd quite naively said, I've never really heard of purity rings and signing purity contracts. So you sort of said, oh yeah, it is happening in this country. So that sort of thing is also something I wanted to talk to you about. Obviously, we've spoken to increasing numbers actually of ex-evangelicals and I suppose these sorts of groups. I'm becoming much more aware of the sheer number of this. It's absolutely astounding. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you found out around this purity culture and what this is doing to people?
Yeah, please? I mean, again, I think some of this goes back to the age thing of teaching young children, prepubescent children, that anything sexual is wrong unless it happens within a monogamous heterosexual marriage. And that can go right through to, sexual thoughts or even just fancying someone. And I think when you're taught that before you hit puberty, you're kind of, you're kind of at a stage where you're kind of going, boys, so, or whatever. Yeah. So, that kind of just as you're hitting the age when you start to become interested in sex and relationships, that's when a lot of this teaching kicks in. Younger for some people. I did definitely come across some people who were being told by the age of about 8, you need to cover up, you need to wear a t-shirt over that swimming costume, that kind of thing. But it is that constant, again, policing of people's sexuality, policing of people's thoughts, policing of people's relationships and what they do with their body. It doesn't keep people safe. Actually, when studies have been done on the age at which people who are taught this have their first sexual encounters, it's exactly the same as everybody else, but it tends to be less safe. It tends to, people tend to have less sexual education, and they tend not to use contraception because that would be, you planned that in advance. It wasn't just a slip up, was it? And therefore rates of unplanned pregnancies are higher, rates of STDs are higher amongst young people who have been brought up in purity culture. And there's actually someone called Lindsay Monroe, I think, who's just published her MA dissertation on purity culture in this country. And she very much points to it as a safeguarding issue, as young people who are more likely to have unplanned pregnancies, more likely to have STDs. But also, I mean, one thing I found was that I asked if people had been taught about consent in a church context. And I think something like 4% of people I surveyed had been taught about consent in a positive way. We were not taught about consent. And therefore, actually, you can stumble into some really unwanted encounters and have no framework for saying no framework for, that was wrong. That wasn't my fault. It wasn't because I led him on, or my top was too low, or this kind of thing. And that carries over into marriage as well, especially where you have gender hierarchies. And there have been plenty of studies by people like the World Health Organization on rates of sexual assault in gender hierarchied societies. I certainly came across teaching that marital rape doesn't exist because a wife always has to be ready to please her husband. and very much, teachings against the laws which have criminalized marital rape. Which again, really sinister. Most people I came across, it didn't go that far. Certainly in this country, most people recognize that marital rape was actually possible, but not everybody. It's very much, it is a policing of men's bodies as well as women's bodies. But women very much get the brunt of it. There's, often you have this situation where men are the leaders, men are in control, men seem to be able to control everything except their own sexual urges. Women are responsible for those. But it's a way, I think, of, one person said to me, one of the men I interviewed said, I feel like it's a way that we as men can project our own shame onto someone else, onto women. And I think that's, that was a really good way of putting it. Of course, it damages men, but when, as a woman, you've got the shame of having a female body, the shame of potentially leading people astray, wearing the wrong top, and by the wrong top, I mean, I look back at some of the clothes I used to wear, and it wasn't just that I was untrendy. It was, it was. The photos are appalling. But then on top of that, you've got, if you actually, as a woman, if you have any kind of libido, that is just horrifying, because you're also being taught that this isn't something that women struggle with. So if you do struggle with that, i.e., if you have any kind of sexual urges whatsoever, that's just doubly shaming. For men, it's very much, well, this is inevitable for men. This is just something that all men struggle with. For women, that's off the cards. And that goes right through to, as I've said, fancying someone, or, sort of self-pleasuring, that kind of thing. It's just, so shameful.
Yeah, that's true. And I remember, so being raised in, we never called it, or I suppose purity culture is something that, a term that I wouldn't have recognised that, but it absolutely was purity culture. And yeah, I mean, things like rape within marriage, I don't think that just wouldn't have even registered as a thing.
No.
I wouldn't have even thought about that could happen. And I don't know what would have happened if a woman in the congregation had have gone to the elders and said, my husband assaulted me and raped me last night. I have no idea what the response to that would be, but I'm pretty sure it wouldn't be what we would hope it would be, because it just it wasn't a thing. It just wasn't something that we would recognise. Also, what you said there about women and their sexuality. I remember when I was a teenager, and the mums and dads would complain about the girls being lad mad, or they're just lad mad. They're talking about boys all the time, and it was like a really bad thing that they were doing, and it was something, as you said, shameful, really. And so I thought it was thus because I did, I was raised in that environment. So you're absolutely right. It's and it is exactly the same formula, exactly the same system, regardless of which group it is, which religion.
Yeah, and I don't think, we didn't call it purity culture when I was in that. No, that's definitely a term. Yeah. If you hear someone talking about purity culture, you're probably on the same page.
Yes.
I don't think they like brand it and slap a sticker on it.
No, although there was branding. So the American Southern Baptist Church came up with this True Love Waits thing in, I guess it was the 90s, late 90s, I think. And that was branded and industrialized and commercialized. And that's where a lot of these silver ring, it's called the silver ring thing, where girls particularly would wear effectively a sort of like a wedding ring, where they had trusted themselves to their fathers until they get married, and there's a whole lot of creepy stuff that goes on with it as well.
Absolutely.
And the interesting thing was how many people I spoke to who'd worn those rings or signed purity pledges had done it of their own volition, and in many cases their parents had no idea. Because I think that particular iteration of purity culture really got going when their parents were already adults. A lot of it came out of a knee-jerk response to the HIV/AIDS crisis. It has its roots further back, and particularly in America, there are roots in the ending of the anti-miscegenation laws. So it was further back. There's an attempt to control interracial marriage. But more recently, and where it gets more commercialized, I think it's coming sort of on the back of the HIV/AIDS crisis in the 80s. It really got going. And therefore, it was much more strict than a lot of people's parents had known, even if they'd grown up in the church. And therefore, they often didn't know what their kids were being taught in youth group.
I mean, that's something I think we should probably talk more about, is warning parents about. Obviously, it's their decision to send them off to Christian camp or whatever, and I guess we would support parents' decisions around raising children within certain boundaries, but surely you should know what is being taught to your kids,
yes, absolutely.
In these places.
And I think there is very much a sense of, oh, well, but they're Christians, we can trust them, particularly if you're a part of that church or that group yourself. And I sort of, it's a really complex thing. I would always say to a parent, okay, trust them, but find out too. Do your research exactly what your children are being taught.
Absolutely.
One of the analogies which is used again and again, and this was global, everybody had come across some form of this. So the idea that if you have sexual contact before you're married, you will basically be damaged goods. And that is taught as you will be like a piece of gum that's already been chewed, and nobody wants a piece of chewed gum. You'll be like a rose with the petals ripped off. You'll be like a piece of sticky tape that's already been stuck to something, and therefore it's unusable. Well, or a cookie with that's had a bite taken out of it, or a lollipop that's been licked, whatever. Endless illustrations, but actually comparing your body, your sexuality to something which is disgusting, something which is used up, something which is no good. It's not only saying your sexuality or your body is only valuable in its use to other people, but it's also really playing a lot of the time on disgust psychology and that sense of revulsion. And you end up with that sense of revulsion towards your own body, towards your own sexuality. And it's just profoundly unhealthy. Someone called Sheila Ray Gregoire, she's Canadian, she's wonderful. She's done, and she and her daughter did a huge survey of 20,000 evangelical women and their experiences of purity culture. And they found that women who had been taught this had, when they were married, they had twice the level of sexual dysfunction, things like vaginismus, than women who hadn't been taught this. Because you've spent so long saying, no, pushing all of this away. You can't just flick a switch. Oh, I'm married now. It's fine. Let's have a great time. Your body just goes, and you can't. And then you've got all the messaging about you have to please your husband. I think it's profoundly damaging, even when it's done ostensibly to protect young people. It's profoundly damaging. And people come out of that not knowing themselves, not knowing their bodies, not knowing their sexuality.
So to pull on a few points that you kind of raised throughout this, so kind of I think it's interesting, the obviously double standards throughout. So there's the gendered double standards, but also the idea of like sexuality and sort of men being out of control, and obviously it's and not able to sexually control themselves for their desire, and it's women's sort of role to contain that or allow that when they're married, whenever. So depending on what state you're in, and also. But what I think is interesting is there's this idea that, there's no way of controlling sexuality, but if you're gay, you can control that and just stop it. And I think that's interesting.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think that, there is in many ways, in those circles, it's almost like being gay is the worst of the worst of the worst. It's horrific. Interestingly, one of the patterns I found, and this became almost a weekly thing. When I was going through these interviews every day, I thought, I got to a point where I was like, it's going to happen at least once a week that I speak to a woman who tells me, until I was in my late 20s, my 30s, my 40s, even my 50s, I had no idea that I was queer. They just didn't know, because your sexuality is so pushed down. You are, in many ways, it almost seems like, this isn't to be sort of derogatory to people who are asexual, but it's almost like before you're married in those contexts, you are expected to be asexual. Except if you say that you're asexual, that's wrong too, because the expectation is that you will enter into a heterosexual marriage. So it doesn't work for people who actually are asexual. But your sexuality is so repressed that often, until you start unpacking that, people have no idea. But I think for those who do realize much earlier that they're queer, it's just, the consequences are huge, are horrendous. Effectively conversion therapy, and the pressure and the shaming. It's certainly something which I've seen treated worse than any other perceived sin.
And it is one of the things that you state that sort of started, or one of the things that affected you to start questioning your beliefs. I think it's the way that people were treated in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Seeing, I think seeing gay friends and family whose relationships were happy and healthy and they were flourishing, and then seeing friends of mine who were Christians who were being made to publicly confess to being, except it wasn't being gay, it was having same-sex attraction, because you can't even say that I am gay. It's because then there's not something you can do about it. But if you're having same-sex attraction, well, we can cast that out of you. And the shaming and the damage that did, I just remember thinking, but who are they hurting? This person hasn't even had any sexual contact. What who is this hurting? Nobody. And I think that was that was a big thing that started me kind of going, hang on a second here. Not sure about this.
I want to. There's a quote I just want to get in, because it's perhaps the funniest quote in the book, and I thought I must read this one out. It's brilliant. It was from a guy called Aidan in the UK, and this relates. It's a different topic really, but I just wanted to get this in before I ask you a question about your leaving process. But it says, the pastor, this is Aidan, one of your interviewees, the pastor, when all the climate change stuff kicked off with Extinction Rebellion, said, God's got this. What the hell does that mean? What it means is you're switching people off to one of the most critical issues in the history of Earth, you dozy twonk.
Yeah.
I thought that's brilliant. But that reflects something we've spoken about on this podcast, that, all the stuff that's going on in the world, actually, you don't need to get involved in that. You don't need to worry about climate change. You don't need to worry about social issues. God's going to sort all that out. You just carry on doing the preaching work or whatever it is that you're supposed to be doing. I thought it was really, really insightful and funny.
Well, and I think, particularly with climate change, there's very much an idea, there's, the idea that, well, Jesus is going to come back soon anyway, so of course the earth is going to end. Without recognizing that, the earth's going to end, and you're denying the very thing that's going to make that happen. I think it's, whether it's climate change denial, outright denial, or whether it's about any issue, well, we don't need to worry about that because God's got this. God's in control. That's
something that there's someone that I watch on YouTube, Lena Norms, and she talks a lot about climate change and positive panic around that. And the big reason for it was, she was a sort of Christian person, and then I guess in the hangover period of coming out of that, thinking, oh God doesn't have it. We've got to do something. Kind of like how intense that is as a feeling afterwards.
Yeah,
Oh,
and I
better
think
get
a
onto that
real,
then.
a snootiness towards other Christian groups, things like Christian Climate Action, or Christians who get involved with things like Extinction Rebellion. I know there are a number of priests who have been arrested for climate action, but a real snootiness towards them because clearly they're just not trusting God enough.
Yeah.
Instead of kind of going, actually, maybe they're doing something
But
useful.
this is the logic, though. So, I mean, this is we haven't talked about the doctrinal issues and the belief systems and so on. And I know I've listened to you in other interviews, and you're respectful to other people's beliefs, and I think that's important. I think we are most of the time, although I guess sometimes perhaps not as much as you. But it is kind of the logical. There is some logic to this. So Jehovah's Witnesses believe that Jehovah God is going to actually transform the earth into a paradise. So it's a bit of a different take on the. So Armageddon's coming. All the bad people get killed, but the earth gets transformed into a paradise. So I know in evangelicalism it's normally people going to heaven, but and the earth can just go to hell in a handbasket. But either way, it kind of doesn't matter to us because, either God's going to sort it all out or he's going to just lay it waste anyway and take all the good people up. So this is the consequence. These are consequences of beliefs. So in my more strident moments when I think, actually, should I be respecting all these different beliefs? Actually, they do have consequences.
They do.
And then other times I think, so I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, and I think, well, yeah, I mean, I can be a lot more respectful of people's beliefs when it's going public, can't I? And maybe less so when I'm ranting quietly at home or to friends.
Yeah.
And particularly, and I think particularly that goes for, I notice that the things that really get me fired up are some of the things which I've been involved in and I've believed and said. And that includes, well, I think probably I never really bought into the stuff around gender. I grew up effectively in a single parent household and saw my mum doing a pretty good job. And I tended to be, I think as time went on, I tended to be opinionated and told various things about my spirit of rebellion and that kind of thing. But I think, that can be a very harmful, that's a very harmful teaching with real world consequences, particularly when it comes to things like domestic abuse. And I've seen female friends kicked out of church because they complained about domestic abuse and their husband was very much looked after. Stuff around LGBTQ stuff. There is, and the vanishing, the invisibility of people who don't fit gender norms. That's just not acknowledged, or it's seen as liberal or woke or definitely sinful, that kind of thing, because God only made two sexes, all this kind of stuff. So people are effectively disappeared if they don't fit that, and that again, that has real world consequences.
Yeah.
There are things I'm prepared to laugh at. We used to do these stupid batty prophetic actions of, which didn't have any consequences, thank goodness, for anybody except to make us look like complete fools. But actually the other things and the severe disciplining of children, that kind of thing, it really does, it marks people's lives forever. And that's where I think it's a whole other level of damage to self and to others.
Yeah, and invoking the Bible or another holy book to say this is what it's told us to do, therefore we are going to do it. I think that should be challenged personally. I'm not asking for you to agree, but I feel like it should. Not all Christians are like that, obviously.
Yeah, but. And that's the thing is, often in those circles, you're so limited in your view of the Bible and the materials, the resources you are given access to. And many of us were taught not to study theology because it might, even Christian theology, because it might make us question our faith. And I look back now and I go, well, they were right, because when I started studying theology, it raised some questions. And when I started studying the original Greek, it raised some major questions. But 2,000 years of Christian scholarship and nobody else got it right except for us, really, and that's certainly not everybody had been taught not to study theology, but I think in a lot of the charismatic churches, it's pretty theology light. And that means that what your leader says the Bible means is what the Bible means. And that's where it gets really dangerous. There is very little room for saying, okay, so you're telling me that the Bible means this, but actually this scholar says it means this. And, maybe we can go with a kinder, the kinder of the two interpretations, maybe where it's kind of not that clear on whether being gay is wrong or right or, neutral. Maybe we can go with the kinder interpretation that doesn't harm people. Maybe we, there's no space for that. And that's, I think, any group which says our way is the only way, and our vanishingly small interpretation of that, our vanishingly narrow interpretation, is the only way. That there's danger there, whatever the nature of the group.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got sort of 5-10 minutes left. Olivia, I did want to talk to you a little bit about your experience of leaving, because I know that can be really, really hard. So what was that like you'd been in this thing since you were 14. I'm not sure how old you were when you left, but you've been in it a long time. What was that like? What was that experience like?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how old I was when I left either. It was sort of a gradual process, really.
Sure.
I think for me, it was a gradual process and an unpicking, and there was a certain amount of turmoil. And I think that I know that there are friends whose trust I have lost, and others who think I'm wrong, but who have stayed in contact, and others, and I found new friends. I think it has been hard, but it has definitely been worth it. And I think that would go for pretty much everyone I spoke to as well. It's hard. And other people lost an awful lot more than me. People were kicked out of their communities. One person said to me, a lot of people used a pseudonym. One person said, can you give me a pseudonym? Because if my son finds out, I won't be allowed to see my grandchildren again. And other people, didn't want their parents finding out because they knew they'd be ostracized from family, or their family would just treat them differently. And, as humans, we desperately need to belong. And that's why people very often stay for so long, because they desperately need that belonging. It's a fundamental human need. So leaving your community is one thing that's really hard, but also in terms of the beliefs, that's a profound shift of identity. It's not just, I changed my mind about a couple of things. That is a huge identity piece. That's an absolute uprooting of how you've fundamentally seen the world. And that's a huge thing to go through. It's going to be difficult. And it can, I think, some people have found it pretty bleak. Some people didn't. It was a much gentler process. But for just about everybody, after some time and often after some therapy, and some real work on getting back in touch with trusting themselves and trusting their own body, it is definitely something which leads to a real sense of authenticity, a freedom to belong to whichever group you want, a freedom to have a diversity of friends. And actually, in many ways, a lot of people found all the things that they were promised within that system, they found when they left. That's the great irony of it.
One thing I thought I'd just mention, because it came up a couple of times, there's a few things you mentioned, I was like, you can, it just feels all very Handmaid's Tale sometimes, doesn't it? When you talk about the, like having someone as your sort of buddy for checking on each other and things like that. That's something that's in the book's really key mention, is that, you're friends, but also you're there to keep an eye on each other. That was just.
There's a lot of that stuff where I remember when I first read The Handmaid's Tale and people were comparing it to church, and I thought, no, don't be silly. But there's times gone on, whether it's The Handmaid's Tale or whether it's Robert J. Lifton's thought reform, those sort of those markers that he gives of that, I kind of go, oh my word, this feels like reading my experience of particular groups. Whether it's, I remember stumbling across when they first criminalized coercive control, and I came across a sort of checklist for coercive control, and I thought, I was actually doing it for work. I was working on domestic abuse stuff, and I remember just stopping in my tracks and going, but that's church. That's my experience of church. And yet, at the time, I wouldn't have seen it like that at all.
Yeah, it took me a long time to use the C word.
Yeah, I still hesitate to use the C word. I think I do think it's massively overused.
I do too. Yeah.
And in many ways, that's why I perhaps feel more comfortable with high control group. But and I don't think all of those churches are cults, but that's a spectrum, really, and it's some of them just are.
Yeah, well, listening to your experiences and reading your book, I think it certainly solidified my conviction that actually my group was a cult, because it's very different in some respects to even some of the quite distressing stories around soft coercion, sort of slightly coercive and discouraging you from leaving. I mean, that's it's very clear you are not allowed to leave, and if you do leave, you're going to pay a massive price. So that's a very different experience, and so it's definitely, for me, I'm very comfortable saying that of my ex group.
I mean, I think the JWs tend to have a more structured and formalized process for if you try to leave, whereas I never came across a formalized process, just like I often didn't come across a formalized hierarchy, but it's there. You just get frozen out, or the hierarchy isn't spoken about. But my goodness, if you try and question, about it, which means that it flies under the radar. But it's there.
It's still there. Yeah, well, it's been fascinating talking to you, Olivia. Thank you so much for joining us today. Again, it's called Uncertain, your book, and we didn't really get onto the reason you'd called it that. I'm guessing it's because of the fact that you are so certain when you're a member of a church or as a Jehovah's Witness. I knew everything, and then when you leave, you realise that there's a lot we don't know.
Yeah, and I think just that a number of people, wherever they'd got to with their faith, and and some were atheists, and some weren't, and some were pagans, and some were just don't knows. Everybody, so many people sort of reflected on the difference between certainty and faith. And the I guess the sort of the fuzziness of faith as opposed to the concreteness of certainty, and that process of becoming uncertain. Yeah.
Thank you, Olivia Jackson. Thank you for coming on Cult Hackers today.
Thanks very much.
So last week was our special birthday episode, and at the end of the show, I read out the names of our guests. And as I'd feared, I missed some people. I don't know how I managed it, but I did. So I just want to say sorry about that. And thank you to Jill Adams, ex-Jehovah's Witness, Bethan, ex-Mormon, Chris Shelton, ex-Scientology, and also host of the Sensibly Speaking podcast, Dr. Yanya Lalich, cult expert, author, and general hero of ours, Robert Crompton, ex-Jehovah's Witness author, and Dr. Cullenthey, ex-Jehovah's Witness academic. So thank you to those, and sorry I missed your names on my last reading.